With the scene modeled, rigged, animated, cameras animated, and lighting materials created and applied, I'm ready to render. For render setup, there's a couple of things to keep track of, and nothing more important here than the project setting. If you haven't set your project, you should. For this particular one, I've set my project here over to First Robotics Maya, which is a directory I created for this competition. In there are all the standard Maya scene files. Having a project set up to render is absolutely crucial, as Maya needs to know where to put those images. I'll go to the render setup and get ready first. I need to name this file. For this, I'm going to work in Camera 2. I'll call it Camera 2 BT for Beauty Pass, because I'll do an ambient occlusion pass later. I usually use some kind of naming convention like this, telling me what scene in what shot and what pass it is. As an alternate, we might see something like this. Scene 1, shot 2, B for beauty. It's up to you how you'd like to name them as long as you can recognize it. I'm going to render these as IFFs, Maya's default image format, which carries RGB, red, green, and blue, alpha channel, and Z-depth if needed, which is great for compositing. Because I'm rendering out a sequence, I'm going to name it and put a number at the end. I'll make sure in the frame and animation extension it says nameNumber.extension. I'll put in frame padding at 3. As we can see up here, file name, it'll go from 001 to 010. Now I'll scroll down and set up the range. This is Camera 2 for me, and so it's going to run from 96 to 144 by every one frame. I also want to make sure, and this is very crucial because I've seen a lot of people miss this, that I'm rendering from the right camera. I'm running from Camera 2 with Z-depth on. And I'm also going to check, yes, HD 720, 1280 by 720, it all looks right. I'll check quality next. I've left my anti-aliasing at custom sampling from 0 to 1. Every pixel gets at least one sample, and at most 4, using a box blur. We could go higher strength on this, but I don't have a lot of fine detail, and there's one other thing I'm counting on. In post, I'm going to put on depth of field and blur parts of the image. I don't want to spend a lot of time anti-aliasing something, only to find out I blurred it out anyway. I'll try this. If there's a place we need better anti-aliasing, I can always come back and do it. Under indirect lighting, I'm going to bump up my accuracy for my final gather. Reasonably, this accuracy might be 300 or higher, so be prepared for a time hit in rendering. I'll put mine at 250 and see how it looks, given my lighting. I'll also go into the final gathering tracing. Under final gather mode, I'll switch over to optimize for animations, and I've got a minimum and maximum radius I can play with here. What this minimum and maximum radius do is allow you to set a radius for final gather points. Outside of that, it will interpolate. I'm going to leave it alone so there's no interpolation for the moment and see how it looks. I think I'm ready. If you want to experiment further, because we use the MIA material X passes and the skin X passes, we can go into the passes here and add in additional passes for compositing. This is nice to do, and if you're in a film style workflow, you'll see this a lot. I might include things like depth remapped, saying the camera depth goes from a value I choose to get a true black and white in the Z depth for adding depth of field. I also might see additional things, like incandescence or glow. Where are things lit or not in the scene? This we can play with further, and the Maya help has pretty good documentation on it. I think I'm ready. I'm all set. My camera is chosen, Z-depth is on, frame range is on, and the file is named and the project is set. One last thing to check, and the reason I'm stressing this is because I've tripped myself up on it before. Under Render, hitting F6 to go to the rendering module, I'll go to Test Resolution and make sure I'm rendering from the render settings. As you can see, my test resolution is still at 50% where I had it for my IPR. I'll check Render Settings and save my scene. I'll save this scene as Render Setup End. Finally, I can batch render, choosing Render and Batch Render. One thing on this, go to the dialog on Batch Render. The idea in Batch Render is it will batch render, and you may see it look like this, Auto Render Threads. It's going to give you use of your computer while it's batch rendering in the background. Well, I'm going to let this render run overnight, and I'm going to let my computer work while I sleep, as many of you may do. I'm going to turn off Auto Render Threads and put my render threads at the number of cores I have on this machine. In this case, my laptop has 8. I'm also going to boost up the memory limit to 8 gigs instead of auto. That way I can run more things in RAM. If you have a render farm, or if you're using Backburner or a similar render management software, this will still apply. Get your render set up before you submit. Now when I'm ready, I'll hit Batch Render and Close, and my images will be waiting for me in the morning. On rendering, there's one last note to leave you with. Start rendering early. Here's why. I guarantee you will render your entire animation through twice. Every frame rendered through twice to see how it looks, with goofs fixed the first time. If you wait till the night before it's due to render, you're going to end up unhappy. So what I do in practice, once I've got the camera in the space, I'll render it. The initial renders may be quick, but I'll take those images into Composite and get my post work going. And every night, whatever I've done on that project, I'll load it up and render. When I put lights in, I'll render it. When I get materials in, I'll render it. As I start painting textures, I'll render. So that by the time I'm approaching deadline in a final render, I've seen this animation through at least 5 or 7 times and can get a pretty good idea of anything else I need to fix. Plus, I've taken it into post and seen how my post effects, my depth of field, my color correction, my glow look on things. So, start rendering early, plan for render time, and take your time and do it right.